Welcome back to English 111. As I discussed last week, when reading literature, scholars divide the text into groups known as literary movements based on the time period and the characteristics of the writing. During the early 19th century, the primary literary movement was called Romanticism. Romanticism was marked by emotion, heavy symbolism, and a focus on the individual. It tended to idealize the world, or, in the case of Gothic Romanticism, offer a fantastical version of it. We saw an example of this in The Cask of Amontillado. Poe presents you with a dark and confusing tale of murder, and he presents it from the first-person perspective of the killer. The story doesn't feature the ghosts and haunted houses of many Gothic stories. Instead, Poe's horror comes from a killer who offers no reasonable explanation for his actions, and who invites us, the readers, into his madness. This is what we call an unreliable narrator. He's our only access to the world. He even addresses us directly, but how can we trust anything that he says? The horror of the story is that the killer is entirely human. He's just like us in a lot of ways, and yet he carefully, coldly, bricks a man into a wall and leaves him to die. He even seems to enjoy listening to the pleas of his victim. Poe seems to be asking, what's the difference between a man and a monster? The Yellow Wallpaper is actually dealing with similar issues, an unreliable narrator, Gothic spaces, and questions of mental illness. But rather than telling the story from the perspective of the villain, Gilman makes the reader ask, is there a villain? The narrator's husband, John, becomes the focus of this question as we, and the narrator, wonder whether John is well-intentioned but misguided, actively harmful, or actually correct. There is definitely misogyny at play as the narrator's needs, experiences, and desires are actively dismissed. But there's also clearly something wrong here. Do John's good intentions count? Or does he bear responsibility for what happens to his wife? The Story of an Hour looks at the issue of female oppression with even more nuance because the wife here openly admits her husband is a good man and that she even loves him in a way. But the desperate sense of hope and freedom that she feels when she hears of his death suggests that even the kindest oppression is still devastating for those who are stripped of their independence and choices. Can you be happy if you have no autonomy? Chopin seems to be saying no. Finally, Stephen Crane tackles this issue of self-determination by looking not at societal restrictions, but at natural ones. What happens when the thing you can't control is the world in which you live? You probably noticed the way the sea in an open boat is made to seem alive and aware. That's a technique called personification, where you give something inanimate the characteristics of a human. Like our unreliable narrators, this is a character who we'll never fully understand. Why does it kill one and spare another? It's notable that the one character who is given a name, Billy, is the one person who does not survive. Crane gives him the most humanity, but that can't save him. The world, in Crane's view, doesn't care about your family, your life, or how hardworking you are. Billy did nothing wrong. He died anyway. What these stories all have in common is an attempt to understand the world in which we live. How do you explain away inexplicable human cruelty? Do your intentions outweigh your impact? How do you live in a society that ignores your needs and dismisses your desires? And how do you survive in a world that you can't control? As you turn your attention to this week's readings, try to figure out what questions these authors are grappling with. This week's readings usher in a new century, and with it, startling changes to American culture. The automobile and other technological advances changed how people interacted with each other, and a new view of art began to emerge in Europe: modernism. In 1913, the Armory Show, a vast show of modern European art held in New York, brought this new movement to America. At the time, it was dismissed as freak art and artistic anarchy. However, these new ideas that broke with tradition and upset the rules and standards of art and literature began to take hold in the minds of artists and writers in America as well as Europe. In 1914, World War I broke out. Although the U.S. did not officially declare war for another 3 years, the stark realities of war once again began to shape the literature of the time. The traditions that had been upset by the new ideas of the Armory Show were shattered by a new modern form of warfare that tore the world apart. Modernists were driven by the belief that the structure and safety once provided by religion, politics, and society were no longer enough. This belief intensified after World War I, when it seemed to many that history itself was coming to an end, and that modern life was horrific, chaotic, and ultimately futile. These writers truly thought that the world as they knew it was over, and they wanted a new way to view and express the world around them. They rejected the past and wished to distinguish themselves from virtually the entire history of art and literature. Some modernists expressed a deep sense of loss and despair. However, others responded with a fresh sense of both the freedom and the responsibility of the artists in the New Age. Many modernists shared an aspirational belief in the role and place of the artist in contemporary life, believing that art had replaced religion in providing coherence, guidance, and insight into the human condition. To give you an idea of how the movements we've been looking at are presented in art, I've posted a selection of paintings in your Week 2 module that illustrates the changes. The modernist period also saw radical experimentation in literary form and expression, such as a breakdown of standard forms and an adoption of stream of consciousness techniques. This experimentation was partly a response to the new forms of expression that were developing in painting, sculpture, and music, and to technological innovations such as telephone and cinema, which were changing the forms and the very meaning of communication. Ezra Pound's famous call to "make it new" is rightly considered one of the modernist mottos. Additionally, most modernists believe that literature should challenge and unsettle readers, and much modernist work is intentionally demanding and difficult. What all the modernists shared was a belief in literature's importance in the modern world and the need for it to be continually vital. While the pre-modernist world is characterized by a sense of order and stability rooted in the meaningful nature of faith, collective social values, and a clear sense of identity, both personal and cultural, the modernist period is characterized by a sense of chaotic instability rooted in the revelation that the collective social values are not particularly meaningful, leading to faithlessness, skepticism, and a confused sense of identity. Our first story for this week, A Rose for Emily, is one that's hard to categorize. It's at once a realist story that focuses on life in a small southern town, a gothic mystery about an antebellum family, and a more modernist story that eschews conventions of storytelling by moving through the narrative in a stream of consciousness mode that ignores the actual chronology of the story. This story is written by William Faulkner, who was born in Mississippi in 1897. While much of his early work was poetry, he became famous for his novels set in the American South, including The Sound and the Fury and Absalom, Absalom. Faulkner was awarded the 1949 Nobel Prize in Literature and ultimately won 2 Pulitzers and 2 National Book Awards before his death in 1962. In our next story, The Hunger Artist by Franz Kafka, the ideas of modernism are on full display in a text that is symbolic and abstract in its presentation of the titular character. I've posted a short video about Kafka in your modules if you want to know more about him and how his life affected his work. For our final stories this week, we'll be moving away from the modernists to the postmodernists. The period after modernism was reacting not just to cultural and political change, but specifically critiquing the modernists, which is why we refer to that period, and some argue the period we're still in, as postmodernism. The French theorist Jean-François Lyotard succinctly defined postmodernism as incredulity towards meta-narratives. That is, skepticism towards the grand narratives that we use to explain the world around us, like good versus evil. Literary postmodernism reacted against the erasure of the past that modernists argued for by intentionally referencing older stories and texts. They rejected the demand to elevate art by intentionally blurring the lines between high and low art. They played with the form of narration by using inconsistent tone, point of view, and chronology, and by having apparently random disruptions in the text. These works tend to be very aware of the fact that they are text, even referencing it to their readers. If you've ever heard something described as meta, that's what they mean. A great example of this from pop culture is the 90s teen slasher Scream. This film, which constantly references the previous slasher films that established a genre, is perhaps best known for a set of rules of horror films that one character lays out. These rules tell the viewer, with a wink and a nudge, that the movie knows what it is and how it works, as the audience gets to be in on the joke rather than being kept at arm's length. This knowingness and the way that texts acknowledge their place in the literary canon, the collection of works that are deemed great enough to study, is a key feature of postmodernism. Even though the writers most often associated with postmodernism may deal with serious themes, their works often have absurd, playful, or comic aspects, and sometimes make particular use of parody and pastiche, and of references to other texts and artifacts. The first of our postmodern writers, Flannery O'Connor, was born in Savannah, Georgia in 1925. O'Connor is considered one of the greatest short story writers of the 20th century. She faced some hardships growing up, losing her father as a teenager, but persisted in her studies. She eventually earned a master's degree and began publishing short fiction. Her work was informed by her experiences growing up Catholic in the South, and religion was to become a recurring theme in her work. This can be seen in our short story for this week, A Good Man is Hard to Find. O'Connor's stories tend to be darkly comic, embracing the postmodern tendency to question the grand narratives of good and bad, right and wrong, that both society and religion teach. Our fourth author, Ray Bradbury, represents a shift in the literary canon away from the traditional great works. Born in 1920, Bradbury is a novelist and screenwriter who focused on so-called genre fiction, including fantasy, science fiction, horror, and mystery fiction. Best known for novels like Fahrenheit 451 and The Illustrated Man, these sci-fi and fantasy novels have long been excluded from the literary canon as too lowbrow and popular. Bradbury, though, broke through that barrier as the recipient of numerous literary awards, including a 2007 Pulitzer citation, and he broadened the idea of what writing is worth academic study and literary critique. On his death in 2012, the New York Times called Bradbury the writer most responsible for bringing modern science fiction into the literary mainstream. As you read, consider what changes in society these texts might be reflecting. We'll look at a few more postmodern authors next week that will show how this was a time not just of change, but also of expansion in the literary canon. As always this week, you have a discussion board post and a journal entry to complete. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask. Happy reading and writing this week.